Hello and welcome back to chapter 13. Remember, we're talking all about economics, aren't we, in this chapter? And we've covered the macroeconomics part of the chapter, so we're now going to move into microeconomics. And we're going to start by thinking about this thing called the market mechanism. Now, market mechanism is all about demand and supply. Okay, and this is what economics is all about. This is what economics is all based on. I mean, we've already been talking, actually, haven't we, about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, now that is the aggregate of all the individual markets in the economy, in the microeconomy. So what we're now going to do is think about the demand and supply for individual products and individual markets. So what is a market? Well, it's any place where buyers and sellers come together. Which is probably just about what you would have guessed, isn't it? So, how is price determined? Well, price is determined in the world of economics by the interaction of demand and supply. So what we need to do is think about all the things we need to know about demand first, then we'll think about the equivalent for supply, and then we'll bring the two together. So, what is demand? Definition: it's the quantity of a good that potential purchasers would buy or attempt to buy if the price of the good were at a certain level. So what demand means is the quantity of a good that buyers are willing and able to buy at a given price. Okay, notice willing and able. Okay, demand is not the same as want. Okay, demand has to be backed up by the ability to buy. So, I want lots of things. I could stand here for the next 5 hours listing the things that I want, but I can't say that I demand them because I can't afford them. Yeah? So there's a difference between want and demand. Now, have a look at this. Little worked example. It says, imagine you have a demand schedule as follows. So this is all about the demand for biscuits by a household over the period of a month. Okay, and we've got various price levels for a kilogram of biscuits. I don't know how many biscuits that is, right? But if that's the price per kilogram, how many kilograms would a household demand? Well, if the price per kilogram was only £1, apparently they would want 9.6 kilograms of biscuits in a month. If the price doubled, we would drop our demand to 8. If the price went up to £3, we'd only want 6.25 kilograms. If the price went up to 4, we'd want 4.5, and so on. So, can you see what happens? As price goes up, demand goes down. There's an inverse relationship. And I think that's what you'd expect, isn't it? You think about any product. Okay, if there's a fall in price, the chances are you buy a few more of them. If there's an increase in price, you may not buy as many. So what we normally assume, and there are exceptions which we'll think about shortly, but we normally assume that we have what's known as a downward sloping demand curve. And this is a key diagram. Okay, and it's worth just being able to sort of scribble one of these down in your workings in the exam if you need to. We just draw demand curves like this, where we've got the sort of vertical axis and the horizontal axis. Price always goes on the vertical axis, and quantity goes on the horizontal axis. And because of this inverse relationship, we end up with a downward sloping curve. The cheaper something is, the more we buy. The more expensive something is, the less we buy. Okay, and that, in the world of economics, that is known as the law of demand. It's not very complicated, is it? Yeah. The key thing is an increase or decrease in price triggers a movement along that demand curve. Okay, it doesn't make the demand curve move. Other things in a minute are going to make the demand curve move, right? But price isn't one of them. Okay, and that's a typical trap to look out for in questions. Okay, a change in price does not trigger a change, a different demand curve, a movement in the demand curve. Okay, what it triggers is a movement along that given demand curve. Now, what factors determine demand then? Okay, what factors determined that if the price per kilogram of biscuits was £3, that this household would want 6.25 kilograms? Well, factors that influence demand are listed here, and what we've done is categorize them as some being within the control of the business, but some being outside the control of the business. So obviously price. Price is within the control of the business, and that's a key determinant of demand, isn't it? Market research. Have you done your market research properly? Have you designed the best product possible? That will influence the level of demand. Okay, product research and development. Again, sort of similar thing from the other angle. Okay, have we developed the thing which the market demands? Have we advertised? Have we done any sales promotions? Okay, have we trained our sales staff? How effectively can we distribute our goods? Is there any after-sales service? Are we going to give credit to customers? Now, we've covered some of this stuff in previous chapters, haven't we? Okay, and you may remember the 4 Ps for goods or the 7 Ps in the marketing mix for services. Okay, these are the sorts of things we're talking about that are within the control of the business. But actually, as far as this chapter is concerned, things outside the control of the business are more important. For instance, the price of substitutes. Okay, for instance, I don't know, what's a substitute for biscuits? Crisps, maybe. If the price of crisps goes down, then maybe we buy more crisps and we buy fewer biscuits. Price of complementary goods. So what's a complement to biscuits? Well, tea, let's say. So if the price of tea goes up, perhaps we buy less tea. And if we buy less tea, we won't be dunking our biscuits in it, so we will buy fewer biscuits as well. Demand is definitely influenced by income, isn't it? That's what we were talking about in the macroeconomics part of the chapter. So the more income we've got, the more of most goods we will buy, and vice versa. And also fashion and expectations. Where things are in fashion, they're all the rage, everybody wants one, demand will go up. And we've talked about expectations, haven't we? If we expect prices to rise in the future, maybe we buy more of the thing now. Now, as far as our demand curve is concerned, if there is a change in price, as we've said, we move along the demand curve. All of these other factors, okay, things like tastes and fashions, expectations, substitutes and complements, these will cause a shift in the demand curve. Okay, so let me just draw that quickly for you. So a change in price means we move along the demand curve. Other factors will shift the demand curve, either outwards or inwards, depending on whether demand goes up or down. Now, we just mentioned, didn't we, these words substitutes and complements. Didn't really explain it in very much detail, did I? So a bit more detail here. Substitutes, you can probably guess, are goods that are alternatives to each other. So if you demand more of one, you probably demand less of the other. So substitutes, I don't know, maybe tea and coffee. Yeah, if I drink more tea, I will drink less coffee. Complements are goods which we buy together. So tea and biscuits. So demand for those will tend to move in the same direction. If I buy more tea, I need more biscuits to dip in the tea. Now, there's a very quick interactive question here. Just have a little look at it. What might be the effect of an increase in the ownership of domestic freezers on the demand for perishable food products? Well, domestic freezers and perishable food products are complements. So if there's an increase in the ownership of or demand for freezers, and more households own freezers, we can afford to buy more perishable foods because we know we can keep them in our freezers and they won't go off. So presumably there'd be an increase in the demand for perishable food products as well. Yeah, so with complements, they tend to move in the same direction. Now, we've said that if your income level rises, you will normally buy more of a particular good. Now, what we're going to do is call those goods, therefore, normal goods. So it's not very technical, is it? Yeah. So most goods, if you earn more, if you've got more money, you buy more of the goods. However, that doesn't apply to all goods. With some goods, if you earn more, you buy less of them. And if that's the case, we call those inferior goods. Okay. Now, just have a little think. What can you think of that if you suddenly doubled your salary tomorrow, which goods would you no longer buy that you buy at the moment? Okay. And I don't know what you're thinking, obviously, but it could be things like I don't know, the value range that you normally go and buy in Tesco. Yeah, you wouldn't be buying value orange juice anymore. You'd be buying the fancy orange juice with bits in it. You know, you wouldn't be buying the value beans. You'd be buying Heinz Best beans or Tesco's Finest beans or something like that. I don't know, cheap bottles of wine. You wouldn't be searching around for the £3 bottles of wine anymore. You'd buy the £8 bottles of wine. So these items at the sort of value end of the market tend to be inferior goods. Now we said in 4.3.5 that income distribution also affects demand. Okay, now we've touched on this actually in the first part of the chapter, so let's look at the interactive question. It says, what do you think might be the demand for swimming pools amongst a population of 5 households enjoying a total income of £1 million if the distribution of income is either as under assumption 1 or under assumption 2? So have a look at these two assumptions. Assumption 1, we've got one very, very wealthy household and 4 households with a very low level of income. Whereas assumption 2, equal levels of income. Now, under which assumption do you think we would buy more or fewer swimming pools? Well, I suppose it depends, doesn't it, how expensive a swimming pool is. Okay, but I think the idea is that under assumption 1, there is only going to be one house there who can possibly afford a swimming pool. Yeah. So the demand for pools will only be 1. Whereas under assumption number 2, we've got 5 households, each with income of 200,000. Now, I don't know if that's enough to afford a swimming pool or not. I guess it is. So I guess under assumption 2, the demand for pools could be as much as 5. So what we tend to do is assume demand for swimming pools would increase under assumption 2. Fashions and expectations, these are going to influence demand, aren't they? Every Christmas there seems to be a sort of new fad. There'll be some sort of new computer game, whether it's a PlayStation 4 or the excuse me, or the latest Xbox or whatever it is. It's all the rage, so demand goes up. I remember a few years ago when my kids were very small with the Teletubbies. Okay, you couldn't get a Teletubby for love, no money. Okay, so when something is in fashion, obviously demand for it goes up. And again, as we've said, expectations will also influence demand. So if you expect something to sell out, then you tend to rush to the shops to buy it, and then that expectation becomes self-fulfilling, doesn't it? The thing does sell out. Yeah. So expectations, we know, play a part. Now, we've talked about things other than price causing a shift in a demand curve. Okay, now if you imagine, I'm sorry this has gone on to the next page, imagine our demand curve has moved to the right. So this is what we could call an increase. Let me try that one again. This is what you would call an increase in demand. Okay, at each and every price, consumers want more of this product. Now, what would explain that? Okay, so which one of these would cause the rightward shift in the demand curve? Would it be a rise or fall in household income? Well, it would be a rise in income, wouldn't it? That would cause the demand curve to shift to the right. This next one's a tricky one though. What would need to happen to the price of a substitute to cause the demand for this product to go up? And I think the answer is a rise. Yeah, if there's an increase in the price of a substitute, we will buy less of the substitute and we'll buy more of this. So what would need to happen to the price of a complement? Well, it would be the opposite, wouldn't it? If there's a fall in the price of a complement, we will buy more of the complement and therefore we'll buy more of this one as well. It would need to be a positive change in tastes. And it would need to be an expected rise in the price of the good. Yeah, if we're expecting the price to go up next week, we'll buy a load more this week. And that's the sort of thing, isn't it, that happens on budget nights. You know, when we all know the price of petrol is going to go up, when the Chancellor puts another couple of p on a litre, so everyone goes to the petrol station and fills their car up. Yeah, so the expectation of a future price rise causes a rightward shift in the demand for petrol. Now, if that's demand, what about the other side of the market then? What about supply? Well, supply is defined as the quantity of a good that suppliers, or would-be suppliers, would want to produce for the market at a given price. So again, a bit like demand, it's the quantity that suppliers are willing and able to produce. Now, just like we've come up with a relationship between price and demand, it's possible to come up with a similar relationship for price and supply, but I think you'll agree with me that it's likely to work in the opposite direction, isn't it? Okay, so with supply, what we find is that as the price of a good goes up, the quantity that suppliers are willing and able to produce will also go up. So this time it's not an inverse relationship, there's a positive relationship. So what we find with supply, or at least what we typically find with supply, is that it's upward sloping. Yeah? So again, we have price on the vertical axis, we have quantity on the horizontal axis, but we expect an upward sloping supply curve as opposed to the downward sloping demand curve. Now, what factors influence supply? Well, again, obviously the price of this good, but what about other things? Well, it could be the price of other goods. Okay, if the price of another good goes up, then what might happen is that a lot of firms might switch out of this industry into the other industry where there's more opportunity to make profit. So the supply in this industry might go down. Or it could be that we have goods in joint supply. So these are goods that we supply at the same time. Now, quite often one is a byproduct of another. So you could say things like, I don't know, beef and leather, for instance. Is it Marmite that's made from the leftover from the beer process? Yeah, something like that in there. So they're in joint supply. So again, if the price of one of them goes up, we produce more of those, and therefore we produce more of this one as well. Costs of making the good. Okay, if our costs fall, then we may well produce more. If our costs go up, we may well produce less. So the firm's costs will influence the amount of supply that it's willing and able to provide. Technological changes. Yeah, as technology advances, firms can produce more. Yeah, they become more efficient, they become more productive. But there are also other factors involved in supply, things that are, potentially outside of our control. If you're in the agricultural industry, or fishing industry, for instance, then things like the weather, tide, natural disasters, they will all have an impact on you. And also industrial action. Not necessarily within your control, but will certainly affect your supply. Now, just like demand, if there's a change in price of this particular product, that will cause a movement along the supply curve. A change in anything else will cause a shift in the supply curve. So have a think about this one. It says, which of the following would cause a rightward shift, so an increase, in the supply of apple cider? So imagine that's your supply curve. Apple cider. Which one of the following, or which ones of the following, would cause a rightward shift? So will cause the supply curve to move from S to S1, for instance, so that any given price, we're willing and able to produce more. If there's a rise in the price of cider in the supermarkets, would that cause a rightward shift? Well, no. All would happen there is we would move along the supply curve. So that's the red herring. Okay, you need to look out for that one. If there's a rise in the price of pear cider, well, what we might be willing to do in that case is produce more pear cider and produce less apple cider. So I don't think that's the answer. If there's a fall in the price of apples, well, that's certainly going to be one of our costs. So I think that one's true. Yeah, we can therefore afford to produce more cider at any given price. If there's good weather leading to loads of apples being harvested, again, I think that would increase supply. And what if we had a successful advertising campaign? Well, again, I think that one's a red herring, okay, because I think that one would affect your demand curve. I don't think that's going to be an issue for the supply curve. The supply curve would be fixed. Now, we'll just briefly mention paragraph 5.4, but we're going to come back to this later. How responsive demand and supply is to changes in price, and also to changes in other things, actually, depends on the time period that you're considering. And the general rule is, the longer the time period, the more responsive we will be, both as consumers and as firms. Whereas in the very, very short run, it's difficult to adapt your behaviour. Okay, so the longer the period, the more responsive we tend to be. Okay, now what we're going to do in section 6 is we're going to bring the two sides of the market together finally. So we're going to bring demand and supply together. Okay, and demand and supply together are going to create a price for us. Now, just before we get on to that, let's just have a quick look at this statement. This is referring to the fact that price serves a couple of functions. First of all, it acts as a signal. Okay, it signals to both businesses and customers various things. So for instance, an increase in price will signal to businesses perhaps the consumer demand is going up, and maybe they need to increase their supply to meet that demand. It might attract new businesses into the industry. So it's got a signaling function. Okay, it also signals to consumers. If we start to see the price of petrol going up, maybe we expect it to go up even more. It also acts as an incentive to firms. So as I said, if firms can see an increase in price, then they've got an incentive to produce more, or perhaps to move into the industry, to take advantage of those opportunities. Now, what's going to happen? Let's just look at it on this diagram first. Where you bring demand and supply together, and where they intersect, will be what we call an equilibrium. So what we've got in this diagram is an equilibrium price of £500 and an equilibrium quantity of 250 units. So equilibrium means where the market is in balance. Okay, the volume demanded by consumers and the volume businesses are willing to supply are the same. Another way of thinking of equilibrium is that there is no tendency to change. Okay, we're in balance. Okay, there's no tendency to change. And we're not in equilibrium anywhere else. So for instance, if the market found itself for whatever reason up here at a price of 700, firms would be willing to supply this many, but consumers would only demand this many. So what we'd have in that case is excess supply. Firms would be producing too many goods. Yeah, stocks would be building up. And therefore what would firms do? They'd reduce the price. And as they reduce the price, they move backwards along their supply curve. So they gradually produce less and less and less. But as they reduce the price, consumers demand more. So they move along their demand curve until we hit the equilibrium. Similarly, if the market found itself down here at a price of 300, what we've got there is excess demand. Yeah, consumers are demanding far more than the firms are producing. So firms are selling out. Yeah, there's nothing left on the shelves. There's nothing in the warehouses. So what do firms do at that point? Well, they put the prices up. And because they're putting prices up, they're incentivized to produce more. So they move along their supply curve. And as they put their prices up, demand contracts. Yeah, we move backwards along the demand curve until again the market settles at equilibrium. So at any other point other than where the two curves intersect, there is a tendency to change. The market is not in equilibrium. So equilibrium is the point that the market settles. Now, let's work through a couple of examples over these next couple of pages. We've got a demand and supply curve as follows. Now imagine there's an increase in consumer incomes. What do we expect to happen to this market? Well, if there's an increase in consumer incomes, we expect, assuming this is a normal good, we expect demand to move to the right. And therefore, quantity, both demanded and supplied, increases, but also price increases. So an increase in disposable income will tend to lead to an increase in quantity and an increase in price. Now, you might remember we were talking about demand pull inflation not so long ago. Okay, that's why demand pull inflation happens. What if a product becomes unfashionable? So there's demand and supply. Well, if nobody wants this thing anymore, demand moves back, doesn't it, to D1. So this is the opposite. Price falls. Okay, as does quantity. Now, what if there's an improvement in technology? Well, just be careful with this one. I think an improvement in technology would affect supply, and that would mean firms can produce more. So there'd be a rightward shift in the supply curve. What would happen as a result of that? Well, I think we tend to see the price coming down, as well as quantity increasing. So improvements in technology, firms can make the product easier, so they pass some of that on to us as consumers, so the price falls. And what if there's a rise in factor costs? Remember factor costs, things like rent, wages, interest. Well, again, that would affect supply, wouldn't it? And if firms' costs go up, then they can't produce as many at any given price. So the supply curve shifts upward or left, depending on how you want to look at it. And what we would expect in that case is to see an increase in price and a reduction in quantity. So these are the sorts of questions you might be asked in the exam. Okay, what you'd need to do, or what I would suggest you do, at least until you become very good at these questions, is just scribble yourself down a quick demand and supply diagram, okay, and plot the new curve and see what's happened to your price and quantity. Now, section 6.4 refers to the fact that we don't always leave the market to its own devices. Okay, and just occasionally, a government, for instance, would intervene and impose a price. So there'd be some sort of price regulation. Now, one possibility is that the government sets a maximum price. Okay, so this might be for something which is, I don't know, socially desirable. So this could be, I don't know, social housing, for instance, where the government knows if they left the market to its own devices, let's say that's demand and supply, that would be the price. But they don't want price to be that high. That is not socially desirable. So what they do is impose a maximum price just there. Now, what tends to happen with a maximum price is we get excess demand. Yeah, more people want that particular thing than is being provided. There's excess demand, and you therefore need to find a way of rationing that excess demand. You know, so you need to have waiting lists, for instance, or I don't know, some sort of rationing. I mean, a good example of this, if you think about it, is Olympic tickets. Yeah, loads of excess demand for Olympic tickets. They could have charged a lot more for the Olympic tickets, but again, that perhaps wasn't socially desirable because they wanted us all to be able to afford to go. So there was huge amounts of demand and a very strange system, it sounded like to me, to ration the ticket allocation. Okay, now just bear in mind what we're saying down here. If for some reason we set a maximum price higher than the equilibrium price, it has no effect whatsoever. Okay, so to take effect, a maximum price has to be less than the equilibrium price. A minimum price is the opposite, obviously. So again, I hope this isn't too small. Demand and supply would give us a market price there, but the government this time thinks that is too low. They think we should have a price of at least that amount. And obviously the problem there is that we then get excess supply. Now a good example of a minimum price is the minimum wage, which the government introduced, well, a long time ago now, isn't it? Okay, and one of the big arguments against them imposing a minimum wage was this exact point, that certain economists thought it would create excess supply in the labour market, and excess supply in the labour market means unemployment. Yeah, they thought workers would be priced out of jobs effectively. So, price regulation. Now that brings us to the end of section 6. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the podcast at that point because we're about to move on to a fairly chunky topic called elasticity. So I think you might need a break before then. So what I'm going to do, I'll stop this one, have a break, grab a coffee, and then when you feel up to it, join me again and we'll continue with this section.